Kitten, now is really not the time. Hey, all right, so we're back, and it looks like my microphone's working now, which is excellent. So welcome. Uh, Kitten,
Usually,
now is really not the time. So, uh, welcome. This week we're going to start with an overview of the interface and a few other things like where to find answers to any additional questions you might have. And thankfully, most of that's right within the Unreal launcher itself. Epic did a pretty amazing job with this. Um, and there's a lot of really good information here. So usually the front page when you first start it up will just have whatever's new. There's links to the forums and the wiki pages. There's links to tutorials. If you go to the Learn tab, you can search for almost anything you want. All of the documentation is built directly in, which is amazing. I cannot stress how awesome that is. But then there's also quick start guides for if you're new to this. Specifically like if you're an artist and you're just interested in bringing your artwork in and making it look very good. Go with the artist quick start, kind of get a feel for the tools you're going to be paying the most attention to. Um, Level designers and programmers, there's sections for you that are similar, but underneath you're going to find examples on how to do any number of things and links to other tools um, that you'll find useful. So anyway, we're gonna go ahead and start, and I'm just going to create an empty project, and we'll just start going over the different tools, kind of what they do and how to use them. Um, Depending on what you're doing in Engine, you might not need to use all of these tools. Like there are some of these that I'm less familiar with because as a level designer or as an artist, I just don't really need to use them that often. But also during these streams, because I'm going to be doing at least one a week and at least an hour per time, we're going to cover a lot of things that aren't actually related to level design also. We'll talk about making particles inside Unreal. We'll look at materials and how materials are created, and how to create instance materials, which will actually help with some of the texture memory that those kinds of materials are going to take up. So in the meantime, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new project. And this is one of the things that I really love about Unreal, and especially Unreal 4, is this new thing. When you go to start a project, you have a number of options here. You can start completely blank. They've got a template for a first-person shooter, for a flying game, puzzle games. Rolling is a new one that's actually kind of fun and insanely hard because the controls are just terrible. But these serve as good templates for whatever game type that you're going to build. So, like as you're constructing levels or bringing in your art, you can quickly see it from the perspective that you would see it in engine or in game, and also get a good idea of how it would look in game. For this, we're going to start with the first person shooter template. Um, and I'll name this first demo. Um, this is kind of important here, depending on how good your computer is. You might want to play with some of these default settings. Mine's set for maximum quality with all the starter content, and it's also set for desktop. You can set it to be for mobile. Um, there's a number of different options available here. Another thing to note is when you start a new project, your options are Blueprint and C++. Blueprint is Unreal's new system that took the place of Kismet, which was their old visual scripting system. Um, Blueprint is, I'm not even sure if there's an exact exponent for how much more incredible Blueprint is than Kismet. Blueprint is essentially Visual C++. Almost anything you can do in C++, you can string together in Blueprint, but it's done in such a way that it isn't too terribly frightening for artists. I'm going to go ahead and select the first person template and hit create project. Depending on how what the speed of your computer is, this might take a few seconds or it could take a few minutes. And if you're doing this on a Mac, I apologize, um, because your computer's probably about to start crying. I tried to open this on a MacBook Pro and it didn't go over so well. It never really finished compiling the shaders, and so like it opened eventually, but it was weird looking. Looks like we're almost in. Yeah, nope, still loading in. This isn't that unusual, and depending on the capabilities of your computer, this could take even longer. Okay, so whenever you load one of these templates, you're always given kind of a default template level. So first things first, controls. To move the camera, you hold down the right mouse button, and you can move it back and forth and up and down. And then to actually move the camera, you, while holding down the right mouse button, use the WASD key. So it's a lot like first-person shooter controls for PC. Also, E will raise you in elevation, and Q will lower your elevation. Um, so let's talk a little bit about what we have here. So this window here, where all the stuff in, is the viewport, and the viewport's got a couple of some of the most useful tools that you'll actually have here. So up here we have our different scale, move, and snap settings. And also this is a quick select for the different tools. So right now it's on move. This is rotate that is pointing at, and then scale. We've got whether switching between local and global coordinate systems, and then the snapping options here. So we can enable or disable grid snapping. We can set the grid snap value, and same thing with rotation and with scale and with camera speed. So, and the camera speeds for when we're moving around in editor. And we can also do that, or used to be able to do it, by holding down the left mouse button, and oh, you can still do it. So if you hold down the right mouse button and move the scroll wheel up or down, you can speed up and slow down the camera when you're moving around in the port here. Um, so starting at the top, these are just some of your more useful items up here. So save, source control. There are plugins for Git, and other kinds of source control. Um, your access to your content browser in case you close it. It's usually by default will show up down here at the bottom of the screen. The Unreal Marketplace, your project and editor settings, and this is where you can find things like your plugin, world settings, which is very important and we'll talk about a little bit later. Um, you can turn snapping on and off in here, socket snapping and vertex snap. Most of these options we'll talk about later. You got access to blueprints, any cinematics that you've set up, and creating additional matinees are here. Build, for anyone who's familiar with Unreal 3, this is where you're going to find your build light and build geometry, build all. Play, exactly what it sounds like. Hitting play will drop you into the viewport. Wow, that was loud. Uh, oh, cool, those balls have physics. I would hope so. Balls should have physics. Anyway, uh, uh, so that's where you'll find those things. Hold on a second. There we go. So then over here we've got our modes panel. And in modes, this is where you're going to find a lot of your tools. So we've got basic as the one selected by default. And so this is going to be kind of the what Unreal thinks are the most selected items. So we've got a couple of different kinds of triggers, some primitive geometry, a player start, a point light, an empty character, and just a generic empty actor. Under lights, we've got directional lights, which for anyone familiar with Unity, that's just like Unity's directional light. It's good for the directional light's pretty good for faking sunlight. Point lights work just like area lights in Unity. Spotlights are exactly what they sound like, and skylights have been around for a while in Unreal 3, but I was always told to never use them professionally, and in other things, just nobody ever did. Um, they look like they're different in Unreal 4, and I haven't actually had time to play with them. I will, and I could give a verdict and an example later. But based on what it says here, is it captures the distant parts of your level, everything further than the sky distance threshold, and applies that to the scene as light. I'm assuming that's something so that the lighting will match what's coming from your skybox. Oh, and another thing, this is kind of important. Most things in the interface, if you hold down Control and Alt and mouse over them, you get that extra big box that's got a little bit more of a description in it. And this works in a lot of different things. So if you're ever not sure about something, that's a good way to go about finding out more information about it. Um, and then one thing really important to note, this question mark here opens the documentation. So if you click it, it will actually directly open a link to whatever page that or to whatever thing that is that you wanted more information about. And this is really useful. You should make good use of this. And you'll also find that if you're holding Control Alt over something, you'll see here it says see full documentation. Clicking that will do the exact same thing and bring up the documentation for that particular item that you selected. Uh, Placing these things is actually just as simple as grabbing one and dragging it out into your scene. And then once it's out there, you can position it manually. You can use the transform box over here. And we'll talk about those things in a minute. So, visual effects are where we're going to find most of our most commonly used post-processing volumes, or not just post-processing volumes, but uh, most of the volumes we're going to wind up using for our visual effects. So you're going to find like exponential height fog, a sphere and box reflection capture actors here, um, atmospheric height fog, the post-process volume. And all of these things are useful for a number of reasons. And again, those are things we'll talk about a little bit later. Deferred decals are something new, and these look really cool. I need a little bit more time to play with them to find out more about them. But if anybody has actually used these um, and you want to jump in and like mention something, feel free to add it to the comments or message me, and I'll bring it up. So next here we've got our BSP geometry. Fun fact, BSP stands for binary space partition. I couldn't even begin to tell you what that means. And don't worry, there won't be a quiz. So these are our brushes for creating geometry in Engine. And when I talk about brushes, you'll see that these volumes here, we have a post-process volume and we also have a light mask volume. These are considered brushes, or used to be. I believe that now in Unreal 4, brushes are specifically these things. And these work in a very similar manner to anything else here. If I grab one of these, I can drag it out into my scene. And one nice thing about Unreal 4 is it creates the geometry automatically. So here, almost as soon as I drag it out, I got a cube. And if I select that, I can move it. If I want to change its shape, I go to geometry editing mode here, and there's a number of things here where I can select faces, I can move them, I can do things like grab this face and extrude. Uh, so here I've got a number of options, like how many segments do I want it to have, um, and the overall size of it. So this is Need to slow my camera down a little bit. There we go. And then you can just grab that face and drag it up. However, I don't really suggest ever using BSP geometry. A lot of people like to use it for their block ends, and I've had people argue that you can convert it to static meshes. When I block out levels, I like to use geometry that I've created specifically for that purpose, generally called white boxing. It's exactly what it sounds like. I just make boxes in Maya or 3ds Max. Um, and and generally what I'll do is I'll figure out the scale of what I'm working in. I'll create the boxes to various scales so that, if I need a 10-foot section of wall or something to that effect, I have a 10-foot section of wall. But most importantly, I get to choose where the pivots are, and that's important for later when assets come down the pipeline. Um, uh, so part of the reason that's important is when you've placed stuff in a level and you're just trying to get a feel for whether or not it works, like we have all these boxes and stuff here. These are literally the kind of things I'm talking about. Um, Later, if I have a asset that's going to replace that box, if I've created boxes and walls and things that are specifically the sizes and shapes that I need them with the pivots in specific places, when I'm ready to replace them, I can right click on them and replace selected actors with from the contextual menu and actually pick the items that I want to replace it with. And if I've done everything right, when I do that, what's going to happen is it's going to just replace that asset and do it perfectly, so I won't have to rebuild any parts of the level. So for me, it's more of a workflow thing, in order to save myself work later. Um, so so next thing, um, oh, one other thing about this though is just because I say don't use it doesn't mean you shouldn't. There are times where it's appropriate. If any of you have played Dungeon Defenders, most of Dungeon Defenders was actually built in BSP geometry. A lot of what you see in the stage that the player is running around on is this kind of geometry, and like they did a pretty good job with it. Mostly they just made a lot of embellishment pieces to cover up the edges. If I deselect this and we look at it, part of the reason that we don't want to use this is it won't normal map. You can apply normal maps to it and it will normal map the faces just fine, but you'll never get rid of these razor sharp edges. And the other thing to note is, when I did that extrude operation, and it created this edge loop, if we look at the faces on here, these textures no longer line up. And then it becomes a lot more work to line those up and to get textures to look good across these surfaces. Part of the reason you don't really want to use them. However, if you just need like a flat plane or a walkway or something, this is a lot faster than modeling something in Maya, exporting it, UV unwrapping it, exporting it, and so on and so forth. Um, so that's just my spiel on BSP. Ultimately, and especially if you were to ever to do this on the job, it really is always your art director's call, and just do what they tell you because they're your freaking art director. Um, so let's see. After BSP, we have volumes, and there's all kinds of different things in here, and we're not going to talk about everything, but we'll talk about a few. Trigger volumes are exactly what they sound like. They're for triggering events inside your stage. So essentially, if you have a big wide open area and you want something to happen when your player walks through, um, trigger volume's a good way to do that, especially if you don't know exactly where in that area your player is going to be, and you need to make sure some kind of event triggers regardless of where they are in that area. These are a good way to go. Uh, Post-process volumes are used for everything from adding depth of field to making underwater areas look blurry and blue. Physics volumes are fun to play with. You can do a lot of neat things with these, like flipping gravity or having it change direction, lowering gravity, negative gravity, which I don't recommend. It's while it sounds great in theory, it's kind of a mess in practice. Um, And then pain causing volume, exactly what it sounds like. So if you have an area where it's like a lava floor or something where you want a player to take continual damage the longer that they're in contact with that, that's generally how you would go about doing that. Light mass importance volume is one of the most important volumes that you need to know about. Um, when you create a level in Unreal, the light mass importance volume determines the furthest distance that the game needs to worry about computing light visibility. All the shadows, like anything that you want, like that will occur within that space. Um, so we can see that out here. It's kind of encompassing the entire level, including the post-process volume. Um, so anything outside of this volume will not have any light computed for it. It's not going to do any GI. It's not going to do any shadowing, anything. Like the only thing that that's going to happen to is whatever is within the boundary of our little friendly yellow box here. Um, So, level streaming volumes are another important one, and we're going to talk about those later. If you've played any MMOs, you have run through many level streaming volumes and probably never known it. Open world games, same thing. If you have ever played a Grand Theft Auto game and you were driving in one of the very fast cars and things stopped spawning, and would spawn briefly in the distance and then disappear. That's because you were passing through streaming volume so quickly that it by the time something loaded in, you were exiting the streaming volume and it was being dumped from memory. Um, a kill Z volume is a volume for determining a point at which a player should die if they fall off an edge or into a pit. Very handy to. I would always have one, even if you don't plan on having a player die like that. Part of the reason I always plan on having one and like to have one is if a player gets trapped in level geometry, if they fall through the level, if there's anything like that, um, I would much rather like get killed and start over at a checkpoint than have to reload my game. Um, and cold distance, we don't really need to worry about. Camera blocking volumes are. I don't like using them, but if you look at the Unreal Tournament levels, like Epic uses the crap out of blocking volumes. They use a lot of them, and blocking volumes are for creating. They're for creating collision. So this would essentially be the same as the collision mesh for this cube. And I think they do this because these aren't calculated as triangles. I'm not entirely certain though. I've been trying to find out more about why they would use blocking volumes. Um, it seems like it's a lot more to work with. But to give you an example of this, so think that was, part of the problem is they're invisible. So now I don't know where it is. Here, I have an idea. Let's put this directly in front of the camera and I'm going to make it big. So if you want to adjust a volume once you've created one, this works just like BSP volume or BSP geometry. You can grab the different faces. If I go to my if I go to my different views here, right now I'm on perspective. Um, like let's say I wanted to go to top. Um, if I hold down Control Alt, I can drag out a selection here to select just these vertices, and then move those around. Right now I don't want to do any of that. So I'm going to go back to perspective view, um, and we're going to hit play. And there we go. So I walked into the volume here. It's invisible, but you can see as I'm firing little balls off of it that it is definitely there. And I run into it and now can no longer move forward. Okay, so actually let's talk about our little camera views up here a little bit more because this is important. This is where you're going to find all of your camera stuff. There's keyboard shortcuts for them there also. This is the important one though. These are your different view modes, and most of the time you're probably going to be working in lit. It's very hard to see things in unlit mode, but until your lighting is in working relatively well, sometimes unlit might be the best way for you to work. I highly advise getting comfortable with wireframe. It's disorienting at first, and especially when levels start getting really full. And especially now with as many triangles as there are in game meshes, this will get insane. It will become absurd and incredibly difficult to look at. But you can isolate the things that you're looking at. You can frame your selection by hitting F on the keyboard. I think I just selected everything on accident. Um, Detail lighting is another good one. This is going to show you where you're getting your best lighting. If you've got normal maps on things, this is how you can view just the normal maps so you can see how they look. Um, we've got lighting only, so it's exactly what it sounds like. It'll take all the textures off everything. It'll show you just your lighting. This way you can see how well it's hitting different corners. Like, here we can see that a little bit of the yellow light is getting bounced back against the edge of this wall. Um, let's see. Okay, and so now we've got light complexity. And light complexity is going to get important when you start having scenes that have lots of lights in them. Like if you got a scene where your players walking up towards an altar and there's like tons of torches and those kinds of things, you're going to want to do your best to optimize like how much light and where the light is hitting. You're not going to want a lot of overlap because that's going to result in hotspots and blown out areas. So this is a really good way to tell. Right now, it just looks like a big square turd in a blue background. So not the most useful at the moment, but it does become very handy later on. Shader complexity, this is another very important one. Triangles and tricounts in games don't matter anymore. I mean, to a certain degree, they do. It's disingenuous to say that they don't matter anymore. However, where most of your memory is going to go and where you're going to take the biggest hit in your frame rate is almost always going to be in your texture memory. And a lot of that's going to be in your materials. And materials in Unreal let you do beautiful, amazing, incredible, wonderful things. The materials in Unreal are phenomenal. I got into making them in Unreal 3. I have always loved them because this is where we really get to make the things we bring in look like art. And it's some of the stuff we'll talk about later. But this is, as you're distributing things throughout a scene, a way to tell. This is especially important for if you're creating any kind of set piece. To kind of make sure that the general amount of texel density is distributed evenly in a level, and there's nothing. You really don't want anything in this field that's going to be like white, purple, or I guess it's like a pinkish glowing white. That's bad. That means it's taking an absurd amount of texture memory. So be on the lookout for those kind of things. Stationary light overlap. This is kind of what I was talking about with not wanting lights to be too close together. And right now everything's green. We don't have any stationary lights overlapping. But if you want to make sure that your torches or street lights or any of your static lights aren't that their areas of influence aren't overlapping, or to make sure they are overlapping in the way that you want them to, you can use the stationary light overlap to see that. Light map density will give you a general, or not a general, it'll show you how dense the light maps are and where the most, like, basically, like the areas that are taking the most processing power. Red is always bad, green is always good, although this is more on the yellow than green side. Um, Reflections, you can take a look at. Oh wow, that's actually really cool. That just made everything super reflective. I can't tell if those are. Oh, that's the cube map reflection actor. It's just, I think that's what that is. Um, all right. Anyway, so we're gonna go back to lit. You also have this little menu here that's show. And this is where you can show and hide a lot of things. So you can show the grid, you can hide landscape or particles or anything else. Especially if you're having trouble selecting something. If you're having trouble selecting water, make sure that translucency has a check mark next to it. It lets you actually be able to see and select it. There used to be a special button you had to press in Unreal 3 to be able to select water, which was kind of, or anything that had any translucency, and it was kind of annoying. So it was nice that they fixed that. All right, so back over to our modes. Um, so here, where it says all classes, programmers, that should be familiar to you. That's exactly what it sounds like. Everyone else, ignore the classes thing. It's just the way that objects are referred to and defined in programming. And so this all classes is just like everything. Anything that would show up in any of these menus, you're going to find here. So paint mode is used for a couple of things. Paint mode can be used for vertex painting, which we'll talk about later. Um, oh, don't worry, Micah. We'll get to that. We're going to talk a lot about how to create geometry quickly and efficiently for levels, and I'll teach you guys things like setting up scale in Maya and Max. And vertex painting we'll get to eventually, because vertex painting will actually change the way that you model some of your assets. There's kind of a subtle art to vertex painting in allowing enough vertices without having too many. And to give like a quick demonstration of how this works, hopefully it'll let me do this. So here you can see my brush, and if you can see uh, the little guy there poking out the middle of the brush, that's just showing you the normal direction. So it's kind of letting me know which one of these surface normals I'm painting on. Um, and what it does is it lets me actually paint color directly onto a mesh. Um, okay. Actually, I don't think it's going to work on this guy. I think if we select one of these, they might not. These might not actually allow for vertex painting. Um, Usually in Unreal 3, you had to create special materials that allowed vertex painting, and I'm assuming this is something similar. Um, oh, there we go. No, now I can see it. I have. Actually, wait, let's grab the blue so I can say I blew it. So you can kind of see what's happening here is it's using the vertices to determine where the areas of most influence are, and then it's averaging between the other vertices. So right now, these two verts here at the top of this cube have all of the color painted into them. So down here, you'll notice we get a gradient from blue to this white color because these two verts down here have no color painted in them. And then these three verts have no color here, so we're getting kind of the same thing. So you can actually create special vertex painting materials for painting on things like moss, where those kind of things, and they will get a little expensive computationally. So be careful of getting a little too carried away. And also, generally, in order to create assets that you can actually vertex paint on, what you're going to want to do is model those assets with extra edge loops in them so that the distance between vertices is smaller so that you get nicer blending. But um, you want to find a nice balance between the amount of blending and the amount of vertices, because while the number of tries matters less these days, it still matters. You still need to be careful, and also, it may it depends on whether or not those assets even need to be vertex painted. However, in your own personal work, it's very fun to use. and you can do some really neat things with it. So I'd look at it some more in your free time, and also it is something else we'll talk about later on. This cube is going through a blue period. There we go. Um, okay, so next we have landscape, and I'm not really going to talk about landscape right now. You'll notice as soon as you select it, it begins to create one. We've got a number of options here. Later, we're going to talk about landscape creation, and I'll talk about using things like World Machine to generate landscapes and to create height maps. We'll talk about doing it in here. One of the things that we're going to do, or that I'm going to do, is I'm probably going to spend about an hour to 2 hours one day just showing how to sculpt your landscape into cool looking mountains. And the really bitchin' part about landscape, one of the things that I love about it, is that um, you can sculpt with a Wacom tablet. So, and it's even got a clay brush option, very similar to ZBrush's. So it's really awesome for sculpting out terrain, and especially if you want really good mountains and whatnot. And for anyone like myself who's ever had to try and sculpt pathways up steep mountains, which is a nightmare and takes forever and is incredibly hard to test, they added a ramp tool. And you even get to determine the angle and the length of the ramp so that you can just quickly add like a ramp going up something at an angle that looks like a player can get up it, and you don't have to spend hours trying to sculpt and get even and make look nice. It's glorious. If you've never had to do that in previous versions of Unreal or in another editor that had a landscape thing, you have no idea how spoiled you are right now. But we'll probably talk about this a little bit more next week. We're not going to get into it too much right now. If you want to play with it, this is where it is. Sculpt on it, have some fun with it. The next one is the foliage tool, and the foliage tool was horribly broken in Unreal 3, but it is amazing in Unreal 4. In Unreal 4, what this does is this allows you to paint static meshes on landscape and on other static meshes. So if you have a log and you want to paint mushrooms on it, and I don't mean like paint little shitty 2D mushrooms, I mean actually paint 3D mesh mushrooms on it, and you've created the 3D meshes, obviously. This is how you do it. So you drag the static meshes from your content browser into where it says drag foliage here. And I actually don't know if there's let's see what's in the starter content. I think there might be, let's look at props. Okay, we got a rock. We'll drop a rock in here. So if I drop a rock in here, um, we'll see like it got it here. It's telling me how many instances of it there are. And that part's important actually, is these are instances of these meshes, which means um, they're going to share things like light maps. So this is a very efficient way to do this thing quickly, or to paint these things quickly. So up here we've got our controls. So we've got our brush size, our paint density, our race density, and then what we're painting on. So right now we're painting on landscape, oh, excuse me, BSP and static meshes. We can even paint on translucent stuff, like if you wanted to use this to paint lily pads on top of a water mesh. This is a perfectly viable way to do it. And then I click, and it adds a butt ton of these. In Unreal 3, the minute you use this, you immediately dropped anywhere from 100 to 150 frames a second. It would drop it to under 30 frames a second the minute there was any geometry instance this way in your level. Right now we've got a lot of instances of this, and we seem to be doing fine. We're not losing anything here, and if we drop into play, we're doing perfectly okay. This is still moving silky smooth and nice. They have no, they don't, oh, I forgot. I was trying to figure out why those were just floating there, and I forgot there's still a blocking volume there. So you'll see that we've got a lot of things here in our viewport, and like we got them there quickly, and uh, almost no like basically no performance hit. So to get rid of these, you hold shift and holding shift and then clicking down turns this into your eraser and lets you erase them all. Obviously, when we click, these are way too close together to be that useful. It's clear that they're interpenetrating on each other. And generally, when you do this, you're going to have lots of stuff in here. You're going to have, let's grab a few more things. We'll grab this table. We'll grab a statue. Uh, let's grab a chair because why the hell not? So if I click these things, we just get a mess of stuff everywhere, and this isn't very useful to us. And this is where coming in here and tweaking these settings comes in a little bit more handy. Like we're going to turn the paint density way down. Like we got 0.11 here. And I'm going to turn the brush size up a little bit more so that we'll have fewer things in greater space. And even now, at least for these kind of meshes, not very good. But you can imagine if these are like flowers and grass and those kind of things, this is very handy for quickly doing these sorts of operations. And like for big maps, especially if you have large outdoor areas that need to be covered in grass and flowers and bushes and those kinds of things, um, you can set all of those things up and then you can really quickly change and tweak some of the numbers for these things. So when you select them here, you can select each one individually, and then down here, I can adjust like what their density per 1 cubic Unreal unit. So right now everything by default set to 100, but if I set this to like 2, um, and then here we've got the minimum distance between our foliage instances. So I want that to be 100 Unreal units. And we want uniform scaling, but we could do free scaling so that it will just scale on all axes. We can lock axes so it only scales on a few of them. And you can use this to maximize the number of usage. You can maximize the use you get out of the various static meshes you make. So that rather than creating a bunch of different static meshes for the same area, you can get away with a handful that have the same impact as creating just a metric butt ton of these things. But really, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to come down into these settings and you're going to have to play with these. You're going to have to, each one of these, I would recommend the little check mark here makes it active or not active, so you can select even what you're putting down. So if you're trying to figure it out, I would click on the thing and look at some of these settings and start adjusting them to be more to your liking, and then drop them in and make sure that it's working the way you want, and then select multiple instances of other kinds of level geometry that you have in there and place them again and make sure they're behaving the way you want. Everything, like all of these things, and especially in level design, and this is more on the world building side, but on the world building side, like a lot of that is just patience and testing something, make sure it works. But this isn't nearly as bad as some of the stuff I've had to do where I've had to place tens of thousands of these meshes by hand and do it accurately. Um, that is a nightmare, the likes of which I hope none of you ever have to face. Because when you have to place like all of the grass and bushes and trees and things by hand, it gets very tedious. And it's really hard to do it well and not make mistakes. So this is a really good way to do it. One thing though is be aware of what you have checked here. If you're only trying to paint on the landscape and you don't want like rocks growing out of your trees, uncheck static meshes and uncheck BSP. So the next thing we have is the edit geometry mode, and edit geometry is for your volumes and for your BSP geometry. I'm actually just going to delete that right now. Um, Down here we've got so that covers the modes. Down here we've got our content browser. If you're familiar with Unreal 3, the content browser is a little bit different. It's organized much more like Unity's content management system is. So it's just folders, and each project is going to have their own folders. You can import folders and assets from other projects into here with the import button. I recommend when you're creating projects, keeping this well organized. We'll talk about that next week when we actually look at some other projects. One of the things we're going to do next week is we're going to look at some of the levels in the new Unreal tournament, and we're going to talk about how those were put together, and a little bit about modular level design and why it's so important. Those of you who know me know how hard I harp on this because it's very, very important. And for anybody who is on our last Game Jam team, you saw exactly why. If you have a good modular system, you can do a lot with it quickly. Whereas if you have to make every individual asset unique, it takes a very long time. It is not very efficient. And generally, by the end of it, everyone will want to kill whoever's decision that was. Anyway, so whenever you need to make something new or import something new, this is where you're going to do it. So let's actually go into the starter content a little bit and go into materials. Um, so materials in Unreal are not like materials in Unity or Maya. And this is something that a lot of people have a really hard time with when they're creating things for games is they think putting stuff together in Maya or 3ds Max is the same as creating material for it. It is not. In some cases, the material can get exported and the game engines will be smart enough to rig up kind of a basic shitty looking material for you. Um, but I wouldn't recommend go about doing things that way. I like having a lot of control over the way my assets look. And so one of the things that I tend to do is when I bring stuff in, I create my own materials for them immediately, even if it's just a simple material. And in Unreal 4, a simple material is PBR material, which means no matter what, it's basically going to look sexy as long as you did your job right. So I'm going to open up the material editor just by double clicking on one of these materials. Um, so one thing to note, everything in Unreal is dockable. So if there's something I use a lot that I want all my screen space for, I will dock it like I just did with the material editor here. Um, so, wow. Cool. Well, this is actually a really good example. So right now, this might look a little intimidating, but what you're going to see is it's really not nearly as bad as it looks. A lot of materials to make them look very good, we will be setting up like crazy material networks, but in most cases, if you're a level designer, this won't really be your job. I do a lot of work on my own and I like knowing things and I'm a glutton for punishment, so I tend to tear into these kind of things. And I really like the material editor. And if you're a 3D artist, it is, I wouldn't go so far as to say vital that you know this, but this is a really good way to make your portfolio pieces look far more amazing than you'll be able to in anything else. The materials you can create in Unreal are, well, they're amazing. They are unreal. Sorry, I had to. Uh, so generally what you're always going to see though is you're always going to have this initial node here. And it's going to be named whatever you've named the material. And these are all of your slots for textures. Where Unity, you would just click on these or drag a texture into them. In Unreal, it works a little bit different. You've got texture samples that you bring in, and then we use all of these different nodes to create different effects on them. Uh, Glad you liked it, Jess. So and we'll talk more about what some of these do. Like a texture coordinate node just sets it's a switch for how much tiling there is, and a lot of the work that we do in these initial materials, you'll never have to do again. You create the material, and then the a lot of this is to determine the overall behavior of the material. So you might have a panner in here if you want something to pan across a surface, or if you're looking for a specific effect like a strobe light or something like that. You could do a lot of that in here. But then you just create instances of those where you put in the textures that you want. You've already got your material created, and the instances just use all of the behavior that you've linked together in these materials here. Um, and this one, like I said, it looks a little bit complicated, but the only thing that it's doing here is it's creating a number of gradients between these two textures, just to create a nicer effect if we look at the actual material over here in the material viewport. Um, Basically, it's lerping, and for those of you that aren't math nerds, lerp stands for linear interpolator. It just basically averages two things based on their alpha. Um, but you'll see that we've just got this really nice effect both in the normal map that you can see across the surface, and in the way this looks in general. And actually, as I move it around, it looks like there's some parallax in there too. Yeah, there is definitely parallax in there. And so the things we see over here, these are the same networks. If we, we've got a constant, a bump offset, a tile inset, a multiply, um, another constant, an add, and then our texture samples, and then some more constants, multiplies, adds, and gradients. But if we go down, we have the same thing down here. These are just all getting blended together to give us this nice effect here. And honestly, really good PBR materials, this is what they're going to look like. However, as these things get more complicated, the material networks and whatnot, on the job, it's less likely that you'll ever have anything to do with them. Generally, your technical lead will create the initial material behavior, and you'll just be told which instances of those materials you should use for what. Um, like some of the material stuff I'm going to show you, there's no real reason for you to know, but it's handy to know. And frankly, I like knowing how to do these things. And I like being a one man Unreal army. Um, and we'll talk more about the tools and the things available here when we actually start making materials. And we'll probably do that in another 2 or 3 weeks. Or depending on how excited I get, it might be a lot sooner than that. So the last thing we have over here is we've got our details panel and our world outliner. And the world outliner you used to have to kind of look for in Unreal 3, but now it's all here. It's right in your main view. Um, we've got controls for turning things visible or invisible. Our details panel is details about whatever object we have selected. So any component I have selected, I can tweak all kinds of values. So we can play with its collision, the light maps, whether or not it casts shadows, and then transforms too. Sometimes it's really handy to do things numerically in the transform boxes. It's not always advantageous to try and snap things. Sometimes you'll have things that don't snap perfectly to the grid. But you might happen to know based on transform settings in Maya or 3ds Max that something has a exact X, Y, and Z position based on where you built it, and so those boxes are really handy for things like that. So that's an overview of the interface. It's pretty straightforward. They put everything pretty much right in front of us to make it really easy to find. Unreal 3, there was a little bit more hunting. Oh, a quick note. Should you do things like start closing panels or ripping them off and losing them, and you need to get something back, anything you need to get back, you're going to find in the window menu here. So all of your viewports, anything that you might need, you're going to have here. And so we can like, oh, there we got our world outliner back, and now we can grab our world settings, or anything else that we need to be in our main window we can find here. We can actually get rid of world settings. Anyway, so that's going to be it for this week. I want to say thank you. Next week is probably going to run longer because we're going to talk about level design. I'm going to show specific levels in Unreal, and we're going to talk about how they were built. Um, we're also going to put some things together. Um, and depending on how much time I have this week, I might do some white boxes and show you guys kind of how they were made. We'll talk about scale in Unreal because Unreal, the default scale is still centimeters. However, for the first time ever, we can now change the scale that the editor is using. So if you're more comfortable modeling in feet, you're not only a goober, but you can totally do it. Um, I would really highly recommend learning the metric system, though. You'll be a better person for it. Uh, anyway, everyone have a good week. Thank you for watching and play with Unreal. Watch some of those videos. There's some great content for learning it out there, um, done by people who know a lot more than I do. And this is an amazing engine. It is ridiculous the amount you can do with it, and I find it silly that people use anything else at this point. Anyway, take care and have a good night.